Welcome to SunScream, a spooky evenings production. Welcome back to SunScream. Tonight's guest is Alma Katsu. Alma writes novels that combine historical fiction with supernatural horror elements. The Hunger, a reimagining of the Donner Party, was named one of NPR's 100 Favorite Horror Stories. Welcome, Alma Katsu. Thank you all for joining us once again, and thank you to Alma Katsu for being my guest tonight. Welcome, Alma.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here.
My pleasure. I just reread The Hunger, getting ready for our chat, and I do have quite a few questions for you about it. Indicating to everybody, as always, we are a very spoiler-heavy podcast. I kind of think of it as being kind of like a book group. So hopefully everybody has bought a million copies of everything that Alma has written and read them and devoured them, no pun intended.
Yeah.
And seeks us out to get some illumination on certain points, and hopefully we're able to do that.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, my first question right off, because you do historical fiction, you have The Deep and you have this one. What draws you to historical fiction and interjecting horror into already quasi-horrific events?
That's a great question. I wrote 3 books before I wrote The Hunger in the Deep, the historical horror novel that I guess most people, if they know me, they know those. And the first 3 books were a trilogy, and they actually had a lot of history to them too, although they weren't centered around one historical event. So I guess for some weird reason, I am really drawn to putting a lot of history in my writing. And I wasn't a historian, and if you'd asked me growing up if I loved history, I would have asked you if you're crazy. It maybe has something to do with the fact that I grew up in a really historic area of the country. I grew up near Concord, Massachusetts. So, if you think of the American Revolution and all that, all the houses that surrounded me were at least 250 years old. There were all these historical scenes, we trudged across them every day and probably defaced them. So I think it's just sort of baked into my genes. And the marrying the horror part to it probably has something to do with that too, because that area of the country is also very spooky. It lays claim to spookiness, I guess I should say. And I've just sort of always expected there to be a little horror in life. And then when you research the historical events themselves, like the Donner Party, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, it's a pretty horrific event. Most people only know or have heard about the very end, what happened at the end of the wagon trail. But if you read, across the whole duration of it, like these really crazy, weird, horrible things happen to them all throughout. So yeah, it just seemed like a natural.
Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about the book, obviously The Hunger is a repeated theme throughout it. I also just think, God, this could just be called The Taboos.
That'd be a
There's
nice
so
challenge.
many.
Right about all the taboos. Ooh.
Because I mean, obviously, cannibalism is one of the, like, culturally, as a
Yeah.
phenomenon around the world, cannibalism is one of the ultimate taboos.
Yes. And when you write a book about the Donner Party, people expect it to be very cannibalism heavy, but it was actually a conscious decision that my editor brought up, actually, that we should push the cannibalism off till the absolute last minute because, everyone's sort of breathlessly waiting for it. Earlier versions of the book had a little bit more in it. But even though the book isn't super heavy with it, and I kind of feel like I have to say that because some people are very squeamish and they've told me to my face, right, that they're avoiding the book because, they're afraid of cannibalism or that it really freaks them out. And I try to tell them, well, you're not going to be confronted with a lot of that up front in the book. And I hope that doesn't disappoint some people. But in order to write the book, I had to read up quite a bit on cannibalism, the history of it and all that, and was really surprised to find out that it was a lot more common in the past than I guess, we're used to in more modern times. Everybody knows about Jeffrey Dahmer, for instance, but probably their list of famous cannibals is very short. Whereas in the old days, you would open up the newspaper and read about, cases of cannibalism a lot more frequently.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and when you do get to it, it's devastating, right? The scene is kind of heartbreaking when it
Yes.
happens, in terms of,
Well,
like, self-sacrifice and things.
Right. Because, it's true of so much horror. Like if you just take it on the surface or someone just mentions something to you, you think of the scary part, right? The thing that frightens you. But when you peel back the layers on all these things, usually there's a pretty tragic story, at the center of it. And that was certainly something I found for the Donner Party. When you really think about what happened, here was this wagon party of roughly 100 people who end up getting snowed in on a mountain pass, and they can't go back and they can't go forward. And they came into it already with their food stores depleted once down to the bone. And, the livestock have scattered or dead or dying. They really don't have a lot of food stock, and yet they're surrounded by their family members, knowing that they're, the good chance that many of them are going to die. It doesn't get much more tragic than that.
It's also just a series of horrible decisions.
Yes. That's the other thing that struck me when I was doing the research. Just how many times, like, I don't know, maybe life was completely different, maybe they were just really up for adventure. You kind of have to think that's the case when you think of how they just left behind everything they knew. And so what modern people would be very daunting circumstances, no transportation, no roads, really nothing, no maps, no GPS, that's for sure, no communications, no cell phone. You have no idea what you're going into, and yet they were like, yeah, let's do it. Pack up everything we have in a wagon and head out.
Well,
But
particularly George Donner and his family, right? Because they were well off. They were pretty set. I mean, some people, at times it feels like early 20th century joining the French Foreign Legion is why some people are on the wagon train. But for some people, I mean, like, especially the way you describe his wagon and with its feather mattress and everything.
well, that was actually historical liberty I took. The Prairie Palace, as it was called, actually belonged to Reed. Yeah.
Okay.
So James Reed. But just for the mechanics of the story, I ended up switching that out. And I hope I put that in the acknowledgments at the end. Maybe I forgot. I tried to stay fairly true to the history, but it is a novel. So, it's got its own story to tell. And so I kind of had to tweak a few things off the historical record to sort of fit the story. But that also was a very surprising thing for me in doing the research, just the range of people who undertook these trips. And so you have to sort of imagine what was their rationale for wanting to do this. And George Donner and his brother they were wealthy farm owners in Illinois. They owned a really large ranch. I really couldn't find any record as to why they wanted to go to California. So I, sort of imagined what their motivation probably would be. There certainly were stories of people, being able to really increase their land holdings by going out west and, in addition to wanting new challenges and all that. But if you looked at the Donner Party, there was this range of people. There was a small tier of folks who you would consider more upper class, like the Donners and the Reeds. Then there were a lot of sort of middle class folks. But then at the other end, you had folks that, and there's a few of them mentioned in the book, that really were penniless. The one guy who died early, George, I think it was George Hardcoop, he was a Belgian. He, had been an immigrant. He really had no money to his name. He didn't even have a donkey. He was making the trip on foot. And as he got sick, was sort of sponging rides off members of the party. And as resources got tight, he was left on the side of the road to die. He was not the only one. A lot of people expected to make that 2,000-mile trip on foot.
So, I mean, it's interesting. You've had this career change. Let's talk all biographical about you in history. You've had a massive career change. Now, I mean, obviously, your latest book is a little bit closer to what you did in your former life. But what prompted the switch? What made you want to sit down and start writing fiction, or was reality becoming too fictitious for you?
Well, there's always that, and that's an interesting thing. Maybe we can get back to it on one of the things I discovered when I was writing the historical horror, and that is how much things that happened in the past that you think we would have learned lessons from, we end up, it seems like we're reliving them today. But yes, I did have a big career change, and this might be really interesting for your students. You think you're going to go one way and then life changes. But honestly, when I was young, I thought I would be a novelist. I wanted to be a writer, but I just didn't know how do you become a novelist? This was in the pre-internet days. It wasn't so easy to really figure out how to make that jump. And also, when you're very young, you may read a lot of novels, but I think it's hard to really understand what makes a really good novel. So in the early years, I was writing as a freelancer, as a newspaper person, and I got the opportunity to work for the Defense Department in the intelligence side of things. So I took the job just thinking this was kind of a way to do something interesting, but I had no intention of staying more than a couple years. And then I would get back to what I thought, I really should be doing, which is writing novels. And I ended up having a 35-year career and worked for several agencies. And it was it was a marvelous career. But towards the end of it, I hadn't even retired yet. I decided I wanted to go back to writing to see if I could learn how to really master writing well enough to write a novel. And it took 10 years writing that first novel. I even went back to grad school. And that was The Taker, which was my first book. Came out 10 years ago. In September will be the 10-year anniversary. And it did really well. It was just reissued this year, which
Yeah,
was
I saw that.
huge surprise. I didn't think anyone would reissue that book. But yeah, and so that was my entree into becoming a professional novelist. And now 10 years later, I just had my sixth novel come out, which is my first spy novel, Red Widow, which you had alluded to, but all the rest it had nothing to do with my intelligence career, which was always a bit of a conundrum because, it's an interesting thing to bring up, but then it makes people sort of forget what my books are actually about. So it was always
Right.
a little hard. Now it's sort of going in the same direction a little bit, although it's still a little hard to market the historical horror novels from the spy perspective. But the training in a lot of ways is very good for being a novelist. I was an analyst, which basically you're a researcher, and so I've been a professional researcher for over 30 years, and that really helps, especially when you're writing something as fact heavy and detail heavy as historical novels.
We brought up sort of like New England, and now I'm sort of also waiting for your New England story. I'm waiting for like your take on the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, or your take on Salem, or something.
I'd love to do something like that. I wanted to do a Salem book. This was a few years ago, and my agent said, no, witches have been kind of overdone. Why don't you, sit on that for a while? And as you know, that's a big part of writing too. It's not just what you want to write, but it's what your publisher also thinks they can sell. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, so they weigh in quite a bit. But the first book, the Taker trilogy, it actually has its roots in post-colonial America. It is set in Maine, actually, where all spooky things originate from, apparently. And so it was really fun getting to, and then it relocates to Boston for quite a bit. So I actually did get to sneak some of the New England flavor in there.
Yeah, I saying it aloud too, just thinking, because yeah, I mean, Salem a lot has been done with. We can't deny that. I mean, obviously, you had the Eggers film from 2016 as well.
Yeah.
But like I don't know, there's so much other stuff I think that could come
Well,
out there.
absolutely. There's I think her name was Mercy Brown, who was supposedly the first vampire in America, and that Bram Stoker even patterned Dracula after that story
Yeah, he borrowed a little bit.
and it's just a creepy place. I mean, growing up in New England, every town, claims to be the spookiest town in America. But honestly, the town I grew up in, Maynard, Massachusetts, is incredibly creepy. It's a little less creepy these days, but back then it was super creepy because this was before this old house. So a lot of houses weren't being restored. It had like 5 large graveyards in this tiny, tiny town. I grew up in a house that had a funeral parlor in one block in 2 different directions from my house. And it was a really, really creepy old Victorian that had weird stains and sound, creaked incessantly and everything. So, it's the perfect upbringing for a horror writer.
Um, all right, so let's dive into the hunger a bit, because I'm curious. One of the things that you get really well throughout this is the different relationships with people, and they all tend to be rather tragic. I mean, I don't think anyone really. I mean, well, obviously, with how it ends, no one really finds much happiness. You get momentary happiness if you're lucky, I suppose. But there's a lot of settling, there's a lot of masking, there's a lot of pretending throughout there in terms of interpersonal relationships, both in terms of platonic and not platonic relationships, right?
Yes. And so this is where I usually say, but so a couple things. One is that's kind of my outlook on life. I guess maybe I'm a bit of a downer, but I'm also really big into telling the truth. And
Sure.
so, from what I've observed, and it's all slanted, right, by what you know and all that. And I realize that I'm probably not a happy person. I had a very difficult childhood and all that. I'm cool with it. I understand.
Well,
But
you did grow up in a Victorian haunted house. So.
right. And and again, I realize maybe this is my perspective, but I worked in intelligence, which a big part of it is reading other people and understanding human psychology. And so a lot of, what I wrote about the relationships and the hunger was certainly drawn from my observations about people. I mean, when you write, you're developing a character, you often model them, right, after people, or you imagine they'd be a certain way, and then using your knowledge of psychology, you can, kind of project what's the motivations for this person, what was their, upbringing likely to have been like. And so, one of the things that I get said a lot, and I really appreciate it, is how realistic the characters are. That they uh, the whole package, their backstories, their behaviors and all that just seem very true to life for people. And I do think it's because I draw on what I've been able to observe and understand about people. And unfortunately, it's a huge downer. Yes. I'm not really good at the upbeat stuff at all.
It's funny because when you have I'm going to say his name wrong now, Kiesebear.
We have a debate on how to pronounce that name, Keseberg or Kieseberg. I'm not sure which it is.
At the beginning, the way you describe it's kind of comedic in its own way, but it's also like a wraith, just sort of like skipping along in the ice, this weird ghost of a man in the prologue. And of course, I mean, I think it's safe to say he's the villain of the story.
Yes,
Or
yes. I
at
mean, if
least
you
the main one.
Yeah, there's so many in their own way. But if you read the history, a lot of he even said himself that he did commit cannibalism. He kind of, if you read newspaper reports, and it's hard to say how accurate those are because newspapers at the time were more for entertainment than actually like fact, right? So a lot of times, depending on the newspaper or the reporter, they might completely distort whatever information they got because they're just trying to sell copies. So you'll find these articles that have him portrayed almost ghoulishly, right, as delighting in what he did. And later in life, he recanted. At a certain point, he opened a hotel with a restaurant, and then he was upset, right, when they wrote about him as the famous cannibal of the Donner Party with a
Yeah, you'd
restaurant.
have to have a vegetarian restaurant, I feel like, if you had to.
You'd think, but he was not self-aware enough. And so when you read this whole thing and then you try to project, well, what kind of person was he actually? And there is a little bit of a twist on him. So I don't know how much we want to go into that, but
I mean, spoil away, go for it.
so there was a lot of debate as my editor and I were working over the book, what is the horror element, right?
Sure.
I don't like to make it super explicit, and I really don't enjoy writing just straightforward tropes, a werewolf, a vampire, whatever. So I did want a little bit of a question as to what's actually going on. Also because sort of the main question of the book is, what does it take to make a man into a monster? Can anybody be a monster? Well, you probably already guessed from talking to me that I think the answer to that is yes. Um, and that's based on a lot of experience observing some very bad people all over the world. But so then you take a character like Louis Keseberg, who, if history is correct, did commit, cannibalism, may have actually murdered some of the people. Oh, sure, they were sick and on their last legs, but he didn't wait till they died. He described eating the liver first, and how he cooked it up in a pan.
Very, very
So,
Hannibal Lecter-ish.
yeah, very Hannibal Lecters. I'm sure, what's his name? Thomas Harris drew a lot on, this all comes from actual reporting from cannibals. What do you go for on the body first? How would you cook it? Did you cook it?
I wonder
Stuff
why
like
the
that.
liver is what people go for first.
Liver and brains. Yeah, it's really
Well,
interesting.
I wonder why. Because I mean, people don't order them in restaurants that frequently, do
know.
they?
Well,
I
some
mean,
people do. Some people really like.
yeah, my mom really
liver.
likes like calf's liver.
Yeah, I ate it
I
when
mean,
I was.
I like riz de veau, so I like the thymus gland to feel. So who am I to judge?
Right. Some people love that stuff, but we digress. But anyway, so he was sort
That's
of
all
a
I ever do is digress.
he must be a fun professor. So it's he's just a really interesting character to try to imagine, to put yourself into his headspace, and how would somebody like that, what stories would he tell himself so that he can continue doing what he does to even get through a day? What stories would somebody like that, tell themselves?
What's interesting you bring up sort of like writing against tropes, because it is interesting because you have these different like factions which bring in the possibility of whatever it is, if it even is a thing, being different things. It could be a vampire, it could be a werewolf, because you have these old world ideas, particularly coming out of Germany and things. But then you have the Native American element, so it could be a Wendigo. And then Tamsin being accused of being a witch by different people. So I mean, you do have sort of like this interesting mixture of possible supernatural answers, or it just could be something even. Sort of the idea that it's a disease that's catchable,
Right. And I
throughout
was
there. Which I
afraid.
mean,
I was afraid to
well,
revisit it.
rereading it in a COVID time period, had a different
Right.
feel to it than the first time through.
It is sort of interesting looking at the book again now, through COVID. Any book that has a disease that's sort of that's widespread, epidemic or pandemic in a way that sort of alters the person that has it. It's really interesting to look at those stories now. But for this particular book, if we get back to the main question, which is, what makes a man into a monster? If you think about it, really what we're kind of talking about is shape-shifting, right? How does one thing change into another thing? I'm glad you raised the Wendigo, because that's a particularly interesting one. That's supposed to be a monster who wears the guise of a man, right? A monster who shapeshifts into a man. So it kind of goes both ways. And I also wanted to show that, this is a story, a myth that crosses so many cultures, right? Like probably just about any culture you can think of has this kind of a myth in it. And so, I kind of wanted to show the universality of it as well, that it's not, just werewolves don't just own the story. So it was really fun to play with that. And, you just kind of hold your breath and hope that readers will go along with it, that they're not going to get too upset that it's not a werewolf story, or it's not a Native American story. On The Taker, because it was so close to vampire stories, but it has its own myth there too. It's not vampires. But some readers actually wrote to me really upset. They thought they had bought a vampire book and they read it and they were shaking it and no vampire fell out.
Well, I mean, too, in terms of Wendigos and the Hunger, it's interesting because A, they come out of the Pacific Northwest. B, actually, the way you become a Wendigo is by committing cannibalism. And the way that they're originally described is basically it's a myth to explain like the cold, biting winds of the winter. So it's actually a frostbite kind of myth.
That's
At
interesting.
its
Well,
origins.
you know much more about it than I do. I read what I could, but it's not like a super, not super information heavy.
No, I'm just telling you, it's an interesting sort of like implication around the story itself too, right? In terms of like where that myth, the teleology of that myth, right? It makes it sort of a fascinating thing to sort of imply back onto the Donner Party itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I loved bringing that in. And, I wish we could have done more with the Native American cultures that were out there at the time. But, if that's not your ethnicity, that's not your background, you can be it can be a little worrisome too. You don't want to be insensitive. You don't want to, it makes it difficult to maybe tell the best story. So I actually sort of pulled back from that a little bit from earlier versions. Yeah.
Which character did you sort of like empathize with the most?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's That's a tough one. I mean, in some ways, Tamsin,
Okay.
because she, back then women had tougher lives. I mean, not that life is so easy now, but tougher lives than now. And when you think about her, I mean, I really projected a lot of personality into her, because when I read her background, that she had started out as a school teacher in North Carolina. She had been married before to someone about her own age, and that they had apparently really been in love, but he died, very early, and she had to go on with life. And she ends up meeting George Donner, who's quite a bit older than her and already has children, and he kind of hitches her start to him. But she had these aspirations that I put in the book. Like, she did want to write a book on flora, native flora, things like that. So I just kind of pictured her being maybe a little, downtrodden or repressed by a husband who doesn't really maybe appreciate what she wants as an individual. And yeah, I don't know why. I just could empathize with her, I guess, a bit more than maybe some of the other characters.
The death I think that upset me the most was Thomas.
Yeah, because he's such a great, such a selfless, interesting character who also had a terrible life. He was patterned after a real person, Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, but because there were just some things that this character had to have, some baggage. I don't know why I felt it was something we couldn't attach to a real person when I attached a bunch of other stuff to real person. But for some reason, for Jean-Baptiste, it just seemed like a bridge too far. So I ended up sort of creating this doppelganger of him, this other character, that it just felt less bad to do these things. It's very
I mean,
morally difficult being a
well, I
writer.
mean, you expect him to die 3 or 4 times in the story, and then the moment he finds happiness or some shade of happiness, it's like, well, there it is.
But that's the writer's job. My
I yeah,
husband is, yeah, my husband is not a Buddhist, but sort of embraces a lot of Buddhist ideas. And he really gets very mad at drama and fiction because there's always so much upheaval and conflict. And I said, yeah, but that's what fiction is. And that's what drama is. It's conflict. You can't have it without conflict. And it just drives him crazy. So yeah, I can't remember if he read this book. He probably wouldn't be happy with what happened to Thomas. Yeah.
I think it's actually also your most cinematic scene in the book. His death.
Yeah, I shouldn't say that was a lot of fun to write, but it was a lot of fun to write. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's this contrast between sort of like the grotesque and the beautiful in terms of like the landscape is just beautiful, with the idea of like this pink sunlight coming up over the snow and the various colors you would see, and then just like the complete tragedy happening all around it.
Well, thank you. Isn't that what every writer lives to do?
Well, it's interesting because that's also, because it's obviously set in the 19th century. It's such a 19th century idea of sort of like this eternalness of nature and sort of the futility of the life of a man.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that really comes through. Before I started writing, my editor had suggested, maybe I should take a road trip, go out there, visit, do as much of the trail as I can. And you can't really do the trail anymore. I mean,
Right.
a lot of it is, owned, it's private property and all that, but you can go fairly close to some of it. So I did the second half of the trip. And luckily I did it in an SUV with air conditioning. But, every mile of it, all that was fresh in my mind, just what the land looked like, how rugged and unforgiving it was, even in an SUV with air conditioning, and modern roads and all that, just mind boggling. So many places where you think, how in the world did they get a wagon through there, right? I mean, it's one thing to do this on horseback. It's another thing to do it on this huge wagon that needs at least 4 oxen to pull it. And there's a whole wagon train going through. So that probably really imprinted on me, very strongly. And, it just made, it did make the setting, just really come alive for me. And I could feel, the burdens that they were saddled with the whole time. And I'm glad it came out in the story so well. Some of the stuff like George Stanton's death is almost exactly, except for the monsters, is almost exactly how it actually happened, which people are really surprised to hear about. He sat there and froze to death in the snow, smoking his last tobacco. Yeah.
Yeah,
Doesn't
that
get
I
any
mean,
better than that.
yeah, I think I was still just so hung up on Thomas's death at that point.
Yes. Well, that was
They're,
really,
they're they're pretty close together.
yes, they are. Well, towards the end, it's just like, boom, boom, boom,
Yeah,
boom, like a
it's
snowball
like,
goes
well,
down.
we were all screwed.
And that was the fun part to write. A lot of times, you have a lot of enthusiasm in the beginning, and if you're lucky, you've got energy at the end, but the middle kind of sags, and as you're getting towards, the big climax, sometimes it's a little hard to come up with enough exciting things. But I do think that in this book, as you get into that last third, it's just like an avalanche. So hopefully as satisfying to read as it was to write.
Well, I mean, another thing you did too that I thought was rather interesting was fairly early on, I want to say in the first third, you allude to Reed's sexuality. And I thought that was going to be it, to be honest. I thought it was just going to be like this illusion, the secret. But then, you actually took time. You went back into his past with his relationship with a young man, and then you went into this, let's say, toxic affair he's having on the trail itself that leads to actually it leads to saving him of all things.
Yes. And well, not the relationship. I don't know if the relationship is true, but the events that sort of pin all that down actually happen. And that's what kind of led me to imagine this backstory for him. He actually did kill John Snyder on the trail. And it's almost inconceivable. How would this man, who was a very solid citizen, upstanding citizen, he had owned a furniture business in Springfield. He was pretty well off man. Um, he'd been in the army. He actually served in the same unit as Abraham Lincoln when
Huh.
Lincoln was a private. Yeah. So, he's a guy that keeps his head, and yet it's a historical fact. He stabbed John Snyder, the drover, to death on this unmarked, and they still never did find the body. But he just stabbed him to death. And it was ostensibly over an argument that Snyder was having a hard time getting the wagon through this pass. And in a fit of, they broke into an argument and Reed stabbed him. And so I kind of thought, that seems awfully unlikely. I mean, certainly those kinds of things happen. So it made me think, what would really cause somebody like James Reed to stab John Snyder? And so that's where my imagination went. Maybe they were having this affair and Reed was going to out him and he had to kill him to silence him in front of all these people. But the same thing is true. They did decide to exile him instead of executing him. It was not US territory. They could have done whatever they wanted. But they decided to exile him, and his daughter did sneak out and give him a horse and a few provisions. Otherwise, it certainly would have been a death sentence. And he ends up coming back and leading one of the salvage parties, months and months later. So that's what I mean. The real life history on this story just screams out, right, to be better known. All these things that most people who know about the Donner Party had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, because you don't even have the Wikipedia version in your head. I feel like for most people, I feel like it's just like they got caught in snow and ate people. I mean, I think that's all you really think about.
Well, when I was a kid, they did mention it in history class, but they just mentioned it, right? They just jumped to the end. They got stranded in the snow and had to resort to cannibalism. If even that far, like I don't even remember in history class it being very clear why they were even teaching us. Um, and then when I went on tour for the book, I expected that most Americans knew who the Donner Party was. I was in for a rude awakening. Mostly people my age knew of the Donner Party, really didn't know a lot about them. People in California knew more, obviously, but a lot of folks told me, younger folks told me, no, it's not taught in school anymore. Maybe they heard it because of the Oregon Trail, that video
Yeah.
game that they used as a teaching aid for a while. But
I have
yeah,
it on my phone actually because I talk about it in class all the time as a joke because
the
it's
Oregon
like,
Trail.
yeah, because I
You
mean
guys,
earlier, I mean I played the 8-bit when I was a kid, right?
yeah.
And you always got amoebic dysentery somewhere. Like you learned in third grade what amoebic dysentery of all things was.
That was actually a little after my time. So younger people that I worked with told me about the Oregon Trail at work. Yeah.
And you never wanted to try to forge your wagon across the river because that always meant you lost supplies.
Oh, really? Oh, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. You know what they used to do is they made rafts. So it often would take over a day to cross rivers. They'd have to chop down trees, lash them together, and then raft the wagons across the rivers. Did they do that on Oregon Trail?
In the game, you take the wheels off of the wagon, and then it becomes like a raft.
I don't know if that's what they did.
I don't think it's accurate. I am just answering the question.
And that's the thing. I ended up becoming this sort of history Nazi going on the road and arguing with editors. Because the other thing I found is that a lot of folks, including editors, there was this golden age of television that was Westerns, right? The golden age
Yeah.
of Westerns on TV. And that's when I grew up. Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, The Rifleman, all those things. I was very young, but my dad loved those shows. So I watched them. And so then I had all these myths in the back of my head, how a wagon train travels, what they do, and all this stuff. And then when I started doing the research, I realized how much I was wrong. So I wrote the book according to the history, and my editors would argue back with me. Well, weren't they carrying like hundreds of pounds of water on the wagons a day? No, they did not
Why would
carry
they do
water.
that?
Right. So no one argued with me, luckily, like when I was doing book events and stuff, like, why is your wagon train so wrong? But I did have to argue with the editors a bit. Like they thought they slept in the wagons at night. No, they did not sleep in the
Well, they're
wagons.
crammed with stuff.
Right. They were packed with goods. They weren't like RVs.
Yeah.
They were like moving vans.
I think you're right. I mean, that's definitely a Hollywood thing. And I guess Frederick Remington's kind of to blame for a lot of that too. If you look at because Frederick Remington created this fake American West kind of idea at the end of the 19th century. And that's what got turned into Westerns, his idea of the West. But I mean, he was doing that from his New England studio. So.
When I think of Remington, I just think of all the explosive cowboys on horseback scenes, like the cowboy riding the horse.
Well, that's part of it too. I mean, because he made the cowboy white instead of Mexican.
Mm.
The 70% of cowboys were from Mexico. They weren't white guys. So
did not know that. That's very interesting.
I just actually last semester I teach a class on representations of race in the United States.
Oh.
And got into all of that with Manifest Destiny in the into the 19th century and how we conceive of things and why. And it's Remington and then spaghetti westerns in the 60s, all the Clint Eastwood, John Wayne kind of movies.
You should teach a workshop for writers and take it around to writers' conferences. I'm sure they'd find that very helpful. Maybe do one for the Historical Novel Society. They could use something like that.
Okay. I'll look into it. Always happy to get paid to do something.
That's right. You gotta multiply your income potential.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean it is a great story to lend itself to something like this too, like the entering it into the horror genre, because I have not seen something like that. Usually if because we have other authors coming on, we have like Christopher Tronis coming on, and he writes this sort of very graphic, it's called splatterpunk kind of Western stories, and those are that works too. But it is interesting because you don't get too much historical fiction that is got that horror bent to it, and you would think that you would see more. I think about the book of The Historian as a good example.
Yes.
um
Yeah.
but you don't get a lot of that, and I'm wondering why.
I'd like to know why too. Um, it seems like a good match to me. And there's some probably not maybe as straightforward into the history as the novels I write are. I've seen some that are, set in a historical period, but have a very specific horror story that they're trying to tell. So that takes precedent over the history. Um, as I said, I'm a researcher, so I do consider that, like, the Hunger and especially the Deep, which is about the sinking of the Titanic and the
Right.
sister ship, the Britannic, that they're sort of complex stories to write because they are so pinned to a specific like timeline and geographic location. It's not like a big made up thing and you're just throwing a little bit of history in it. It's anchored by very specific history. And so it requires a lot of research and a lot of pinning the story to history, right? Which I don't think appeals to most people. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I was talking to Clay McLeod Chapman not too long ago, and his book is situated in the Satanic Panic of the 80s,
Mm.
which is also just fresher in people's minds. You have about half the population alive right now who experienced that in some
Right.
form or another.
Right.
But particularly the 19th century in American history, people don't know the 19th century in American history.
Right.
Like they
Right.
could, they probably could name one or two presidents from the time period, if that.
You're
And
absolutely right. But as a writer, you kind of live in fear of the people jumping up and like coming after you and saying, you used a
the,
brass button in this scene, and they did not have brass implements at that time,
we call
because
that the well, actually. So you push your glasses up. Well,
yeah.
actually.
But so here's the other thing. So that does happen. Unfortunately, a lot of, not always, but sometimes the person who's so sure of their fact is actually wrong.
Mm.
But like when you're doing a briefing or something, I mean, a presentation, a tour stop, you can't really correct people. They don't like that.
No.
So you kind of have to think of a nice way to sort of get around it. Like I was doing the D, which just to give people an idea, like the Hunger, like I said, is 100 people in the wagon train. That's 100 people. You don't have to know everything about them, but you got to know a lot, right? There were 2,300 people on the Titanic. That's a lot of facts to know, right? There's a lot of research. And only a handful, of course, I pulled out real people to be characters in the book. But still, that's a lot of facts to carry around in your head. And this one woman who was sitting at my first event, sitting in the front row, very pleased with herself, how much she knew about the Titanic, went on and on about who did she think was on the Titanic? Not the Astors, of course, they were on the Titanic, but I can't remember, some other big muckety muck of the day, not on the Titanic. And, I can't just correct her in front of everybody. It was, so you have to say things like, oh, that's very interesting. I don't recall them being on the passenger list, but I'm going to have to go back and check my records, right? And you're just imagining the whole audience is thinking, well, how good can you be if you didn't know these people were on the Titanic, right? Happens at every event. It just mind-boggling. Yes.
Well, the Titanic too. I mean, there's like an obsession about the
Yeah.
Titanic, right? And then you've got like the weird sort of, there's one in Vegas, there's one in Orlando, like the interactive museums of the Titanic and things. And so, I mean, people really are
really into the Titanic.
Yeah, and I don't even understand why. It's such a weird.
Well,
I think part of it too is British and Americans have this weird British fetish that they get
well,
really
yes,
into.
definitely that is part of it. The Cameron movie, of course, just made a whole generation of people have this crazy romantic relationship with the Titanic. I was not a big Titanic fan. Going into the book, I just decided to write the story because I had heard there was a woman who survived both sinkings. And I
There's a
thought,
guy too in the furnace room.
quite possibly, I don't know, but Violet Jessup is the famous one. And it just was like such a because she was she was a steward on the Titanic. She was a maid basically, and she ended up being a nurse on the Britannic, which was a hospital ship at the time. Very, easy to romanticize background, right, for a character. So I just knew as soon as I heard that you can build a story around that, right? But I wasn't a Titanic fan, and it almost stopped me from writing the book because I knew there were these legions of rabid Titanic fans who would be waiting for the first mistake that you made to jump all over you. As it turns out, people who really love the history of the Titanic are not so interested in fictional depictions of it, as it
That makes
turns
sense.
out. Unfortunately, we were hoping that, there'd be this ready-made audience. And I'm sure there's been some crossover, but you don't get invitations to talk to the Titanic book club. We'll just say that. Right. If
No,
you write
and
a story about the Titanic.
the furnace guy, I only know there's this British kids TV show that I really like called The Horrible Histories.
Oh, I've heard of that.
And there's a segment they call Stupid Deaths. And it's a lot of them are very silly deaths in human history. And this guy comes on in one of them, and he was in like 4 major ship sinkings, and he was always working at the furnace room, and he lived through all 4. And the weird thing about it is like, so because it's like the Grim Reaper who does the segments, right? And he's like, and then you died. No. And then you died. No. And he's like, well, how did you die? Oh, at home of old age in my bed.
Yeah, and there's something very nice about that, right? But like I said, as you do the research, you find out all these interesting things. Ship sinkings were so common that people who made their living working the ships often had, lived through several. There's one character is in the book, John March Starr. He had 8 sinkings in his lifetime, and he died on the Titanic. The big one finally got him. But it's kind of shocking when you find out how often these things happened.
Well, it's also there's a guy who survived both like Hiroshima and Nagasaki too. Like,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Huh. I'll have to look into that one.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just like so let me ask you some more like generic-y questions I like to ask people at this point in the interviews. What's going on with the Hunger? We're gonna see the Hunger pop up anywhere else?
Well, it's had an interesting life. Ridley Scott optioned the movie rights before I even had a book deal.
Wow.
But as often happens, it sort of died in development with him. So we got the rights back, and a little while ago, a very well-known Hollywood showrunner contacted me, and he was interested in developing a show for it. And we got pretty far along, and then the pandemic hit, and it for about a year there, it was almost impossible to really sell ideas to Hollywood because they didn't know when they were going back in business. Ironically, I did sell Red Widow during that time. It only took like 9 months. But so we held off doing anything, and then we were all ready to pitch it. And then he got signed to an exclusive deal on another show. And
Okay.
so
I think I've already even figured out who you're talking about.
I'm sorry? Have you figured out?
Who...
He's a wonderful guy. We've become good friends, but very generous with his knowledge too. But now he's tied up in an exclusive, and so we have to see like how long that's going to last. But it's not like I'm hoping his show fails, but as soon as it's free, hopefully we'll start pitching it again. So that's where that is. And he did come up with a wonderful idea for the show too. So it would be like a limited series on Netflix or something like that.
Yeah, a lot of my guests have talked about projects being in development hell.
It's really hard. So the spy novel Red Widow also did end up getting picked up by Fox, so for broadcast television, and it took a long time to close that deal. And it wasn't until afterwards I was told that it was lucky to ever even happen because so few deals got made during the pandemic. And now it's in development, but I also signed on to be an executive producer. So nice. I actually have to involve me in things. They can't just like go off
and you get even more money. That's even better.
If you go into production, yes, it'll be more money. But so now I'm getting to see what they mean. And it's we're doing pretty well. Fox seems very, very committed, although they haven't greenlit, going into production yet. But now that I'm watching it more closely, I'm surprised any TV show ever gets made. It is
Yeah.
really, really hard to come up with the magical combination of the showrunner who comes up with the right story pitch, and you talk to the right people at the right studio who are receptive to the idea. It's really hard,
And
really
it's
hard.
funny too, because you think of all the like the schlock that you
And then
see
there's
on
that,
TV
right?
juxtaposed with it. Like, because there's so many good things, like this would be an excellent limited series, right? It's sort of, as I said, there's these wonderful cinematic moments in it that they film themselves.
Right. And so you think, oh, what a great property. You read a book and you think this would make a great TV show. Why hasn't somebody done it? And then, like you say, you see these things that are like just retreads of, regurgitations of the same old tropes over and over again that you're sick of watching, and everyone you know is sick of watching. But I can see why, because you have to please so many people to get greenlit. And everybody has an idea. Hey, I think that story would be better if you had a talking dog. Okay, let's write the talking dog into the script. Or, what you have there is so unrealistic. Really, I was a spy for 35 years. You think it's unrealistic? Because it's not Jason Bourne. I think he should fly. It's just like, it's kind of crazy. Like, why don't you take a chance? There was something about the story you loved. Why not tell the story? Why
Yeah,
change?
it's fun. So I'm writing an academic book, and one of the chapters is on Dracula, the '92 Coppola version, which
Oh,
has Bram Stoker affixed to the front of it.
yeah.
And if you listen to them in interviews from time, they talk about how much they stuck to the novel. Like, you just stick to the novel. But the funny thing about Dracula is there's 200 plus movie versions of Dracula, and not one of them actually tells the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's mind numbing to me. It's like, well, then why were you interested in it in the first place?
Well, I think what happens is, Hollywood is full of creative people, and creative people really, it's like you tell somebody a story and their mind's already spinning in another direction. Oh, it would be better if it had this or that. It enriches the story. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes it a better story, especially for a different medium. That's what I'm learning about TV. I'm not precious about this. I understand my book works as a book, but I can see where it would be a challenge for TV series, especially modern audiences have really come to expect
Yeah.
so much conflict, so much drama, so much action, especially in the spy genre, that my book wouldn't fly the way it is, the
But
way the
this one
story.
has all that.
Well, I like to think so, but I have to say that so the showrunner who I was working with would end up being the executive producer, and one of the reasons he was interested in it is he mentors a lot of young writers. And so he had this writer who hadn't been a showrunner yet, and he wanted to see if it would give her the opportunity to pitch her own show. And she did a magnificent job developing this into a show. I really, really hope we get the opportunity. I'm thrilled with what she did with the book. It just makes it better in so many ways. And that's the interesting thing as a writer, when you go through this process and you get the luxury of seeing how another creative person, would see your story. And then you ask yourself, God, why didn't I see that? Why didn't I think of that? It can be frustrating, but it can be an amazing gift too.
So what's on the horizon now? I mean, in terms of like your writing.
Yeah, it's really confusing. So, yeah, because I've got like these two things going that are very different, and I'm not exactly sure how this is going to play out. The next book that's going to come out, which will be next spring, is the next historical horror. The book is called The Fervor, and it has to do with World War II, the Japanese internment camps, which is actually a bit personal to me because not only am I half Japanese, my husband's half Japanese, and all his family was interned. So we know the history, we know the stories, what the people who were in the camps went through. There's a lot of history there too that most Americans aren't really aware of.
Well, they're never
Well, they could
taught.
be. There's a lot of great documentaries out there.
Yeah, but
So there's that. And for the trigger event, I take the fire balloons, which a lot of Americans don't know anything about. But towards the end of the war, the Japanese actually launched unmanned balloons that had incendiary devices in the hopes that they would just, just like sending a message in a bottle. They had no steering on them or whatever. And there's a little bit more to it that I'm not going to reveal because I don't want to, no spoilers. But that's going to be the next book, The Fervor, next spring. And then I'm working on the next spy novel.
Okay.
So I have like 2 series going, and hopefully involved in this TV project. Hopefully that's going to take off. And so I'm pretty much going to be giving up sleeping very soon.
I feel you.
I bet you do.
Well, because our fall event is all live, and it's like 37 straight days of it at 7 o'clock at night every night for us.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's a lot to read for that as well.
What a marathon.
Yeah, it's funny because last year when we originally were discussing doing it, Juan and I were talking about it's going to be 13 days, and then we got a lot more interest than we thought we were going to get, and then this year it was everybody, and then people started recommending other people, and it was like, oh, okay.
Wow. So how are you getting prepared for that? Are you dreading it, or are you already thinking about
So I've always loved horror, and I've always loved Halloween. Like, I had a trunk of costumes when I was a kid,
Oh my
and I would
goodness.
just dress up all the time and drive my grandmother, who was like, this strict Southern Baptist woman, crazy.
Oh, so you must be just chomping at the bit.
Well, it's great because you experience this too. Like you now get to be an author, and that was what your dream was early on. It's like, well, now I get to do horror all the time, and my career has become horror all the time, and so my career is always Halloween. And the only thing that tells me it's not is the weather outside. If I could like pause it on a New England fall outside, I'd be just perfect. And
Right.
but yeah, so it's kind of great. And I mean, the other thing is we've opened up a lot of people's eyes to like a lot of the variances in
Mm,
horror. Because I think too many people think it's all gore all the time, and that's deeply inaccurate.
right.
And
Right.
that's also, not to keep complimenting you, but that's kind of one of the cool things in here too. Like I mentioned, there's like different aspects of the horror genre that live in here, and that's also not something you see usually put together in a single work. Normally it's a single theme that a person hits on over and over again, and I think that's why I like the book so much, is
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
all
I
of
mean,
those
I've
different genres coming together.
really put a lot into crafting it. And I do think uh, it's going to sound weird, but there's something about the intelligence background, the analytic background, that after you do it for so long, it almost becomes second nature, like recognizing, all the themes or key elements that really should be in something to make it so holistic, to really make it representative of the whole and not just, like this little view into it. And that's something that, for better or worse, I seem to carry into all my books. So
So
makes it a little different.
I got a couple more quick questions for you.
Oh, sure.
What was your first exposure to horror, apart
Probably.
from the street you lived on?
Yeah, side of my house. Probably Edgar Allan Poe. I read Poe very, very young, like 8,
Yeah.
7 or 8. I was one of those rotten kids who are always sneaking into the adult section of the library and taking books down from the shelves. And even though I didn't fully understand or appreciate it, in a way that you need to be older to, I'm sure just some elements of it just, seeped into my soul as, wow, this is really cool. So that probably had a lot to do with it. Yeah.
Okay. Um, Now as an adult, looking back, do you have like a favorite horror book, favorite horror movie?
So I was also the age where the Hammer horror films were on all Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
So I watched a lot of that, and it probably gave me this over appreciation of the Gothic. I really love a lot of Gothic themes and that sort of thing. But the other big one I have to say is I'm of the age that would come home from school every day and watch Dark Shadows in the afternoon,
Okay.
the Dark Shadow soap opera.
Yeah.
So yeah, that really influenced me, and I still see it creeping out in unexpected ways. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about Dark Shadows here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So influential.
Yeah, I have autographs from all the main cast except for Grayson Hall.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
wow. They used to have like a convention for it
they
or something.
do. It's up in Tarrytown.
They still have it. What do you
Hmm.
know? Yeah. I'll have to go someday. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the cast is definitely older now. Jonathan Frid died a few years ago.
Yeah.
Obviously, Joan Bennett died quite a while ago. Um,
What did you think of
okay.
the movie remake?
Oh,
There's some funny scenes though. There's some funny scenes.
it's fine on mute. I mean,
Oh,
the problem with it is it's not the story of Dark Shadows. And the funny thing is they actually made a movie of Dark Shadows, right?
yeah.
There's the House of Dark Shadows, and it's like, why don't you just remake that script?
Well, that seems to be all Hollywood knows to do these days. They're sort of satires or parodies of
Yeah, I
things
mean,
that were once
it,
popular.
you were talking a minute ago about like too many cooks in the pot with too many ideas. I feel like that's what happened to that script because you had such super fans involved.
Yeah.
Tim Burton was a super fan. Michelle Pfeiffer even a super fan of Dark Shadows, but they just, Carolyn being a werewolf and things. It's just uh, you have characters that are werewolves. Bring them in if you want to have a werewolf, and like
Yeah.
Roger being a philanderer, not liking us. I just, it's like that's not the story because it's about this family. I mean, and that the family is about everything above all in that story, and that's really the way it was depicted. I strongly disagreed.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head that it just happens so often, right? Like it's they're trying to steer this very big ship into this very narrow port, and it's scary as you get, when it's not working and you get closer, and so you just start trying anything that you think is going to save it or connect with fans or something like that. So that's probably what happened. But you see so many movies where that's the case, and it's such a disappointment, what could have been.
Yeah, and I mean they went for laughs way too frequently.
Oh,
With it.
absolutely, yeah.
I mean, because the show's not fun. I mean, the show's funny unintentionally when it's funny, because it was nicknamed Mike Shadows, and it's not until so many boom mics drop into the.
No, I didn't know, but
Uh,
yeah, and I was a young teenager, and young girls can be so loyal, beyond all reason. So I just remember having this just crazy intense love for it. I probably wouldn't have put up with any criticism, of the show at the time.
there's a great scene where Reverend Trask is doing an exorcism, and a fly just keeps landing all over his face. And I mean, the actor, God bless him, because they did not cut. Uh, he just keeps going. I'm like, but it's kind of realistic because it's like, if you were actually exorcising a witch, something might happen to you, to
Right,
distract
right.
you and try to break your concentration. So,
That's so funny.
but I really liked that act. I can't, his name's not coming to me, but yeah, he was quite good in the show. So my final thing I wanted to ask you, that we ask all our guests is, give me a horror blasphemy.
Ooh.
So something that you like or dislike that is felt otherwise by the general populace.
Oh, there's probably a lot, because I'm not a conventional horror person. Um, and that disappoints so many people. I know a lot of the more popular up and coming horror writers, right? And they love horror. They grew up in it. They read everything. They watch every movie. And I'm just not that. I hope people can forgive me. I'm more of a generalist, right? I studied writing, and I worked in intelligence for a long time. I didn't have the time to do a lot of other things. So while I can appreciate well written horror, I'm not, I didn't bathe myself in all of these, in the canon, so to speak. So, like I never could really understand this love of zombies. I just don't understand the appeal of zombies. Now, more recently, I've seen more zombie shows that I can embrace a little bit more. And I'm a huge, huge Shaun of the Dead fan. I mean, I probably can repeat every line in that movie myself. So I guess there's got to be a little bit of the zombie lover in me. But zombies and werewolves too. I just don't get the appeal of werewolves.
Even though you hint around werewolves quite a bit in The Hunger.
Yeah, I mean, in The Hunger, I did have to do some research on it, and that made me a little bit more empathetic, sympathetic to vampires. But I mean, I'm sorry, werewolves, but I still don't love them. I do like vampires.
I don't know that I've read a really good werewolf story. I mean,
Yeah.
I like the idea. I haven't I haven't come across The Howling's a good movie, but
I think I saw it a long time ago. But again, so I don't like embrace zombie movies and werewolf movies because there's just something about the creature that, that isn't compelling to me. I wanted to like Penny Dreadful, the show, the TV series, a little bit more because I love Gothic, and they were really stretching for a few things. But for me, it just ended up not really holding together very well.
it had moments. I liked the Dorian Gray kind of
Yes, I
story in
like
there.
Dorian Gray. Josh
Um,
Hartnett, he could do whatever he wants. That would be fine. But yeah, some of the storylines just, I don't know, missed
yeah,
opportunities.
fair enough. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed the chat, and obviously, I really enjoyed the book as well.
Well, yeah, thank you. This has been so much fun.
My pleasure, and thank you all for tuning in. And as always, stay spooky. Thank you for tuning into SunScream. Tune in next time for Christopher Triana, author of The 13th Coyote.